I pranked you. All right. Um, Sorry about all the difficulties. Tonight's small problem was my own fault. I clicked on the wrong. I clicked on tomorrow's live broadcast link instead of tonight's. So I'll probably have to send you a fresh one for that tomorrow. But that's fine. Okay. Good. Right. Thank you for returning tonight. And for those of you, I think there might be a few of you who didn't tune in last night. Last night's broadcast was cut short by a technical failure on my part. I really don't know what happened. There was no obvious fault with the microphone. It just suddenly, when I put down a glass, it suddenly cut out. It doesn't seem to be happening now, but it might happen again. If it does happen again, keep your eye out in the comments, because I'll leave instructions there. But anyway, what I'm going to do now is the main event of tonight is a reading of The Tower of Moab by L.A. Lewis. But what I'm going to do now is finish off The Tiger Skin Rug by Lucy Boston from last night. The microphone failed at a rather exciting time, rather critical time. What I'm going to do is go back a couple of pages and then lead in to the finale. I was irritated with my wife the next morning over breakfast because she seemed to be making far too much of a fuss about that howling. I mean, what else could it possibly have been than a cat? I said. I rather snapped at her, I'm afraid. It didn't help that I suspected also that Satanos was laughing at her. You know, his smile was too polite to be spontaneous, but I also felt it was too bold to be quite polite. Now, I mean, I flattered myself that we had a good deal in common and that I was rather his sort. But, well, you know, you've got to know a man pretty well before you laugh at his wife. And that grin of his, you know, showing all his teeth, it went too far, I thought. It jarred. And besides, yes, all right, if I'm honest, I didn't like the howling myself, either that night or the next night. It was abominable, in fact. And the more I thought about it, the less I liked it, because I could think only of two causes. Either it was a natural sound made by an animal, in which case that was certainly an animal that I did not care to have about the place, or else it was supernatural. I mean, it was diabolical enough, God knows. But of course, a sane man can't very well come down to breakfast of a morning and announce over his toast that he thinks the devil's in his back garden. So nobody actually said anything. Next thing was that the cook left. Yeah, I mean, no reason or notice, just left. My wife was very upset, of course, with a visitor in the house whom she so much wished to please. But you see, just as Satanos had been most appreciative of her regime before, so now he became the easiest to please. Camp life suited him to the ground, he said, and he insisted on trying his own hand at cook. And Brian followed him for the first time in his life, seeing the kitchen as a place of adventure. I wrote a note to the Bensons asking them to keep their horrible dog away from the garden, and I took it upstairs to my wife to see if she thought they'd be offended. It was a Saturday morning, and she was counting the sheets with the housemaid. "If you please, ma'am," the girl was saying, "might we have Bibby come in to put a piece of felt along the bottom of your door? There must be a draft flowing in, because your new rug won't lie flat. I can't keep it straight. He gave me such a start when he went in last night to see it heave up like." "Oh, my good girl," I said, handing the note to my wife. "It's as hot as an oven, and there's no wind at all. Please talk sense." "Oh, no, well, no, I didn't say wind, sir. I just said draft," she said lamely. "Yeah, well, I don't like it either," said my wife. No, not in this hot weather. No, she's right. You don't want fur in your room when it's like this. Take it down with you, love, if you're going, and put it over the couch in the sitting room. So I did that, and I sent Bibby off to the Bensons with my note. The sun was torrid. For nearly a week it had been getting steadily hotter, and after lunch, even Satanos seemed to feel it. He settled himself down on the now fur-covered couch, lying full length with his hands behind his head, the embodiment of strength and ease. "Julia, it's time for your rest," said my wife. And of course Julia protested. "No, let us stay down and lie here," said Satanos drowsily, rising from the couch and leaving an almost perfect mould of his head, shoulders, and hips in the soft rug. He bent down with a rather strange smile to pick Julia up, but she suddenly turned mulish. Didn't want to lie down, she said, and she wouldn't be put on the couch. She tugged grumpily at the wrist by which he held her. Meanwhile, Brian, who was annoyed at seeing his idol defied by a child, bounced onto the vacant couch and, wrapping himself up in the ruck, said, "All right then, you go upstairs, Julia. It'll be the better for us. We won't have to have baby talk." And it was at this point that something rather shocking took place. Because Dr. Satanos, as if he was suddenly give way to a fit of irritation, abruptly crouched down and, putting his face right up to Julia's, directed at her his beastly, terrifying snarl. Now, all right, perhaps it was only meant as a lesson, a moral against naughtiness, or perhaps it was just a bachelor's clumsy joke. But to me, in that moment, it looked like real malice. My wife snatched Julia up, and she fought for breath in choking terror and hurried her out of the room. "Yeah, I'm sorry you did that," I said to Satanos, who'd now walked to the mantelpiece and turned his back on us. In fact, I felt quite outraged. "Oh, yes," he said. "Camp jokes clearly go down very well in the nursery, it seems. I do apologise." He shrugged and lit himself a cigarette, and in the mirror I saw his slanting eyes fixed on the unconscious reflection of Brian, who was wrapped up now in the tiger skin rug. Well, I chiefly remember the rest of that day for the heat. There was no respite from it. The doctor had atoned for his lapse of temper by doing more than his share of work around the house, and before long my wife was once more smiling her gratitude. And as the sultry day drew to a close, this tall figure and enigmatical vitality more and more dominated the house. And more, a dread and presentiment closed in upon us. Brian particularly seemed restless and ill at ease. In bed, my wife talked and turned. She wanted me to throw back the blankets, alter the blinds, open the door, anything but settle down to sleep. I knew, of course, quite well what it was that was keeping her in suspense, because I felt the same, and I determined to keep watch. And so, lifting Julia into my wife's bed, that was an instinctive action. There was no sense in it. I slipped between the blind and the window, armed with my rifle. The moon was at the full, riding among high clouds which travelled slowly on a hot, gusty wind. 2 owls called and answered across the garden, their ghostly cries tracing the direction of their flight. The leaves rustled in my ears, and a spider's thread trailed across my face. Suddenly, a jay's harsh note rang out across the wood, and I knew the signal. I waited in agonized tension for what seemed like an age, and still too soon. That wild and howling cry swelled out from somewhere very close now beneath the window. It was enough to draw the very soul out of a man, and my heart stopped beating when I heard it. But again and again it came from here and there, and presently I realized that a figure had come out onto the lawn. I was standing there alone, the moonlight falling full on his face and rumpled hair. And it was Brian. He was walking slowly, as though dazed, and he looked helplessly around as if someone had been calling him. I leant out of the window and shouted to him, but he seemed not to hear me. He'd taken a step back, and now he was staring into the bushes below me. But now he turned and began to run, looking backwards towards the house as the object of his terrified gaze drew its long body out of the shadows. With 2 or 3 bounds across the lawn, it overtook him, and with an infernal cry, it bore him down. I fired convulsively. Cry and shot re-echoed through the wood. And then the heaving mass was still. My wife lay sobbing through chattering teeth as I rushed out of the room. I stumbled down the stairs in the dark, and I stopped to feel for the electric switch at the bottom. And it was then that I saw with a shock that I'd almost run into a silent, unexpected presence. The moon shone through the fanlight in the hall and fell on the red hair and pockmarked face of Dr. Satanos. His features were bent close to mine, his lips drawn back nearly to his ears, smiling gloatingly at my undisguised terror. "Satanas!" I shouted as I switched on the light. But there was nobody there. "Satanas!" What a name to echo down one's hall in the dead of night. I turned on all the lights and I ran from room to room, and they were all empty. His own room had a disused look. Outside, I saw Bibby hurrying from his cottage, and he was on the lawn before me. He looked strangely at me as I ran up, and I saw that what lay at his feet was the tiger skin rug, wet with dew, and underneath it was the body of Brian, dead, with a bullet wound through his head. It was some days after this before I spoke to my wife of Dr. Satanos' disappearance. You see, she too looked queerly at me. She seemed to shrink from me, as if I'd said something unforgivable, or opened one of those subjects whose existence could never be acknowledged. That is the end of the tiger skin rug. So just, to show there is a complete gap between the two, we're going to have a couple of minutes of the metronome. All right. Yeah, someone asked for subtitles. I'm afraid I don't know how to do subtitles on YouTube. Apologies for that. Um, right now, we're going to have the Tower of Moab, which is the main event for tonight. Now, the reason I'm doing this, I was introduced to this story only a few months ago, and next month I'm going to be doing a recording of it for Cadabra Records. If you don't know them, Google Cadabra Records. They're an American company, and they release very fine editions of vinyl records of weird tales with musical accompaniment. And I've done a couple of things with them already. And next month I'm going to be recording this for them. So one thing is I want to time it to make sure that it fits on an LP. And the other is I just need to rehearse it to hear what it's like out loud. So I'm just going to note down the starting time. Perfect. 18 minutes in. So The Tower of Moab by L.A. Lewis. My introduction to the Tower of Moab came about in the course of travelling salesmanship. I mean, it's not, I take it, strange that I'd never previously heard of the place, since the local residents are hardly aware of its existence, save as a familiar landmark, and incidentally, a fair stage for buses. I mean, I dare say it is not sufficiently historical to be widely known, whilst yet past its prime as the 9 days wonder that it must once have been. All the same, in these days of cheap public transport, thousands of people from all parts must constantly be seeing it. And to my mind, it would be very odd if they failed to mention it in their hometowns as something of a national curiosity. I may, of course, be prejudiced by its special significance to myself, and yet I want to make it very plain now that when I first set eyes on the tower, I saw it only as a rather unexpected ruin, remarkably unblemished by time. Now, I use the word unexpected because the place is situated quite near the centre of one of our minor industrial towns. It's close to the crossing of two main roads where every yard of land must be worth a good deal for shops, flats, and so forth. In fact, the base of the tower is entirely surrounded by such buildings, which may account in part for the scant heed paid to it, because, I mean, like the cathedrals of Canterbury or Peterborough, many other cities, it's quite visible from the adjoining thoroughfares, and its ragged summit, viewed from a greater distance across the sea of roofs, tends to lose interest with the absence of detail. I was travelling in the neighbourhood, as I've already said, one of the numerous things I've tried since the war with fairly consistent non-success. My parents had been killed in an air raid, and the paternal capital, one of comforting dimensions, was now brightening the life of Russia. Hence a series of diverse and badly paid jobs, the one of the moment happening to be salesmanship. Like the rest, it appeared to almost have run its course, and with about one order to my credit for a 3 weeks tour, I was anticipating the firm's valediction at any moment. There was, however, one more call to be made to complete my list for the district, and it was through that the Tower of Moab was first mentioned to me. I was directed to take a bus and dismount at the Tower of Moab for the shop that I wanted to visit. Now, feeling curious about the odd title of the place, I asked the conductor what it was, and I was informed that some obscure religious sect had started to build it less than a century ago with the idea of continuing its elevation until, like Babel, it should reach heaven. I mean, by all accounts, funds had become exhausted, and the monument was discontinued after attaining a height of 200 feet. The cult had died out also, ostensibly for the same reason. But you see, owing to the phenomenal strength and massiveness of their handiwork, the cost of clearing the site for new buildings could not be justified. More than this, my informant could not tell me. And having alighted there, I caught my first glimpse of the tower through a narrow alleyway between two blocks of houses, just the top part, with its uneven skyline, dentured as the workmen had left it, and without even the dignity of age to tone down its crude yellow tint. But I had little difficulty in finding the required address, and I encountered the usual reception. The proprietor was too busy to see me. Now, in my probationary week at the showrooms, I'd been schooled in various methods of dealing with this form of passive resistance, and by the exercises of blandishments 1 to 5 on the syllabus, I finally succeeded in entering the presence, who, clearly annoyed by the failure of his assistant to get rid of me, wasted 10 minutes of his valuable time in telling me that he was perfectly satisfied with his existing supplies and he was damned if he'd open any fresh accounts. And all of this with the most deliberate offensiveness. And this, you see, was after I toiled from place to place in grilling heat, lugging a heavy case of samples with me. All right, undoubtedly someone had upset the man earlier in the day, and I only mention him to illustrate how the reaction of one temperament to another may in turn affect a third, and how he was thus the unwitting link joining my former purely material life to that menacing shadow realm in which I now walk. Thoroughly disgusted with his disheartening treatment, sick of genuine endeavour, and weary to the depths of my soul at the everlasting uncharitableness of mankind, I responded to an inherited trait which never obtruded itself on me in moments of success. I walked straight from that shop into the nearest public house, threw my bag on the settee in the saloon bar, and I began to drink. Now, the room into which I had rather unnoticingly wandered was admirably suited to the mood that possessed me. In the first place, it was empty, and in the second, its one tall window faced the counter, whilst in the corner between it and the fireplace was one of those rail-backed leather-covered settees, long enough to accommodate about 3 people. By occupying one end of this and using the other as a leg rest, I could enjoy the combined privileges of having the light at my back, standing my glass on the windowsill, commanding a good view of the barmaid for the purposes of effortless replenishment and deterring any chance newcomer from sitting sufficiently near me to start a conversation. I mean, I'm not a misanthrope, but, equally, I've never been one of those gregarious souls who expand in direct ratio with the number of their immediate neighbours. And that day in particular, discouraged by years of drudgery and furiously angry with the object of my last visit, I wanted above all things to be left alone. And it was with a great relief that I saw the barmaid surreptitiously produce some paperback thriller from under the counter as soon as she'd served me with my drink. I'd chosen to sit with my face in the shadow because I realized that I was in all likelihood scowling like a stage villain, and it would have upset me inordinately had I thought that the girl would observe it and imagine that I was being theatrical. Neither did I wish her to see some unconscious mannerism displayed, leading to the suspicion that I was a common toper. I am sensitive on that point because normally I have the craving well in hand until some rebuff brought out a spirit of savage recklessness from below the surface. Anyway, that Saturday morning in July, I sat in the grimy little bar, gradually stimulating myself to the pitch when I could put away the petty irritations of my job, my lack of capital, and my general burden of ill luck, and rise into the nirvana of concentrated objective thought. 8 or 9 double scotches served to bring this about, save for a dull resentment that fate should compel me to take my pleasure in this squalid place instead of the dignity and comfort of some stately country home. I glanced furtively at my reflection in the overmantel mirror to make sure that my features were suitably composed and showed no trace of what I consumed before strolling to the counter to study a timetable. As I did so, I caught a reflection on the opposite pavement, and above, through the same alley that I'd previously noticed, an angle of the Tower of Moab, shining vivid yellow in a watery gleam of sunlight. God, it really was an extraordinary conception. for a group of almost present day people to indulge. Yeah, I thought over the bus conductor's summary and I half decided to broach the subject with the barmaid in the hope of gleaning further data, but I decided that that would probably elicit more small talk than I wanted. Anyway, I already possessed the main facts, which were in themselves food enough for speculation. Now, I tried to recall the story of Babel from the Old Testament, but I'm afraid I found that after the fashion of post war Europe, I'd so long neglected church going and religious discourse that most of it had faded from my memory, in common with Jonah, David and Goliath, and the rest of the old Sunday school favourites. Assuming, however, that Babel was historical fact and not a myth, I could fancy that the relatively ignorant people of that time, I could imagine them attempting to reach the sky under the impression that it was solid. But you see, how anyone could entertain such a notion after balloonists had quite disproved it was absolutely beyond my comprehension. I myself, I'd been a scout pilot in the flying corps. I'd been in the habit of flying at altitudes of more than 20,000 feet. And the whimsical idea struck me that plans for a tower at least 50,000 feet in height would be needed to persuade an airman that there was still territory to explore. Although not an architect, I realized that the hopelessness of designing a base that would stand the weight. And I further suppose that the Earth's rotation would bend such an edifice like a whisker. You see, no doubt there had been, and in fact there probably still were, plenty of fools who would give money for a project of this kind through their ignorance of mechanical laws, especially in the name of religious belief. In fact, one could easily picture the founder of the creed, elder, or whatever he called himself, almost certainly in the building and contracting line himself, collecting subscriptions with his tongue in his cheek and telling his disciples that in a matter of 40 years they could enter paradise without the painful necessity of dying. I decided that I'd go out and take a closer look at the means. When I finally stood at the base of the tower and gazed up at it, I was chiefly struck by the incongruity of its surroundings. It was the sort of erection one would have looked for on some windswept and desolate hill where its devotees could get the atmosphere of walking with God in high places. And yet here, as one approached, it was even more arresting in its ability to preserve a very real dignity, despite its prosaic background. In fact, almost one ceased to hear the traffic or to see anything beyond the mass of this gigantic hollow pillar. Because, that was its simple form. 4 walls with a base perhaps 50 yards square and forming a plain vertical shaft. Had no interior decoration, neither was there evidence of galleries or even a staircase. I wondered how the builders had raised the large blocks of masonry, and I suppose that they must have hauled them up with ropes and pulleys. But you see, if the inside of the shaft was uninteresting, the exterior most certainly made up for that. And passing out through one of the small archways in the base of the walls, I crossed to one side of the island of wasteland in which it stood, and I made a slow circuit of it. Groups of dirty children are playing here and there among piles of old tins and rubble, and I saw a few slatternly women looking down at me from the windows of the tenements which backed onto the shops and better class houses of the street. Because in fact, these hardly penetrated my consciousness because I was so absorbed in the huge scale designs which began nearly 100 feet above my head. The ugly yellow colour that had first caught my eye was, I found, the pigment of some kind of cement, presumably very hard because it showed little sign of cracking after 70 or 80 years of weather. And with this, the whole thing was covered, forming a medium of tiers of elaborate moulding and scroll work at intervals of 10 feet. The upper portion of each wall blossomed into a panel at least 50 feet high, and it represented some scene out of biblical history or the Revelations and executed in the same cement modelling. One of them looked like the Archangel Gabriel sounding the last trump with an immense horn, out of which poured a volume of Hebrew script. Whilst round the corner on the next face was a tumultuous scene, so crowded with figures as to defy interpretation, but probably depicting, I thought, the day of resurrection. But what the other scenes were, I forget. But at all events, each had the quality of impressing. I mean, partly by reason of its height from the ground, its gargantuan execution, and also its literal reading of what I'd always vaguely regarded as allegorical. Well, one sometimes gets the same feeling from the prints in an old family Bible, in which the air is full of the most substantial looking winged angels, and there's a pit of demons in the foreground. I've always thought that young children being shown that kind of thing go about thereafter expecting to meet them. Anyway, I've been gazing up at these figures and ruminating along such lines for longer than I realized, when the Tower of Moab worked its first spell on me. The sun was now shining with considerable heat and brilliance after a mostly overcast and showery morning. And if it was this, coupled with the amount of whiskey that I consumed, or in fact, if it was just the effect of staring too long against the bright sky, I don't know. But I suddenly experienced one of those alarming optical phenomena which one associates with liver disorders, and I found a sort of blackness descending on all objects to the left and right, bringing an instant feeling of faintness and causing my eyes to water violently. It only lasted a moment, during which I steadied myself on the stick with a natural instinct not to attract attention by collapsing in public. But in that instant came a swiftly passing but awful sense of despair. And the words rushed into my head, "My God, it does reach to heaven." Now, exactly why that thought arose, I can't possibly say, because at that time I'm positive that my eyes had registered nothing supernatural. I mean, most probably it was the inner working of intuition warning me of something monstrous and intimately bound up with my life. Well, by now I'd missed 2 trains, and feeling that one place was as good as another for a lonely weekend, I decided to remain where I was until Monday morning and then catch an early train to get me to the office by 9 o'clock. I mean, this move would save me the trouble of posting the firm that night, as I should be able to forestall the mail and make my report personally. I may as well also admit that, yes, I had a desire to complete what I'd begun in the public house without the staling effect of an interruption, because it's always been my way that after starting an orgy, I've got to finish the job properly. The craving, in fact, which is non-existent for the first 3 or 4 drinks, appears strongly after half a dozen. My problem then was to secure a room at a place where I could get as much as I wanted to drink without having to fetch it myself, and without the necessity of smuggling it to bed and pleading sickness. I mean, the notion of lying in bed to take whiskey robs the beverage of all its charm. Nor do I care about having it in a bedroom at all, even sitting up fully dressed. A licensed hotel, therefore, appeared to be the best solution, and one of the larger places at that, where an ample staff would supply me legally at any hour without raising eyebrows. But as it transpired, I was saved the bother of a search, because on returning to my first port of call in time to wedge a couple before the closing hour, the landlord said that he could give me a top room for as long as I liked, with access to his second floor private sitting room, which he told me he never used himself. Now, of course, the place was not residential, but in fact, that suited me all the better, because I ran, therefore, no risk of bumping into acquaintances. Whilst the saving of money was another consideration, the landlord being a sportsman and agreeing to a very moderate figure of 3 shillings for the night. Being, moreover, a publican, he would not care what I drank, provided that I did not become a nuisance. Now, having heard a few tap room customers depart and seen all the street doors locked, I followed him up to the sitting room, which proved to be a perfectly comfortable place, well carpeted, some good armchairs, and I proceeded to establish myself in the right way by ordering a bottle of whiskey and 2 glasses. My normal manner of reserve was now dissipated by my previous potations, and I was able to keep him thoroughly amused for a good hour, I think. And I feel sure that he took it himself in the right spirit when, at the end of that period, I tactfully explained that I like to do a lot of writing in my spare time, and I would like to be left pretty much alone for the rest of that day and Sunday. This would allow me, you see, to give full rein to my greatest relaxation, slowly stimulating my thoughts to farther and farther flights till I felt like a colossus of wisdom dominating the globe, but with no fear of those irritating interruptions occasioned, for instance, by well-meaning people who want to tell me that it is cold for the time of year, just when I'm nearing a conclusion on the possibilities of Mormonism as a workable social basis. Anyway, as my new friend went out, I asked him with studied casualness if he'd send me up another bottle, adding that I was quite accustomed to it and that it clarified my mind wonderfully for my work. And I think he was sincere in replying that he took his hat off to a gentleman who could put it away like me. I reflected that the barmaid must have mentioned my morning session because I'd only had half a bottle in his company. And that did tickle my vanity because I consider fighting the stupefying effect of alcohol to be about the finest test of willpower that there is. I mean, hitherto, I'd had no ill results, my constitution throwing off a carouse reliably and well. It annoyed me, therefore, to find on crossing the room on this occasion that there was evidently something wrong with my liver. The Tower of Moab loomed in full view above the opposite house by reason of my 2-story climb. And as I glanced across and took in a general impression of its yellow mass against an indefinite blue background streaked with smoke, once more the pall of blackness crept in from the tail of my eyes, leaving nothing else in the picture. And then a great flash of brilliant white light seemed to spread fan-wise from the bridge of my nose, and through it, and among it, to my distorted vision, the tower seemed to grow beyond all dimensions of human conception, until it reared its ragged neck illimitably into the sky's vault. Next, numberless bright stars fell slowly, curtain-like, between me and it, and the moment after I was back in a chair, seeing the room as usual, and controlling, for the benefit of the girl who appeared with my whiskey bottle, a desire to breathe gustily through my mouth. I fancied that she looked at me queerly as she withdrew, as though she was waiting for something, and my next actions would, I think, have proved interesting to any observer. I mean, they fascinated one half of my mind, certainly, which was just then studying my body's movements with an introspective but amazingly lucid detachment. I waited until the servant's footfalls had receded into the distance, and then I walked quietly up to my bedroom, where I carefully washed my face and hands in cold water before returning to the sitting room and uncorking the fresh bottle of whiskey. This done, I poured a tumblerful of the neat spirit, placed it carefully on the table, and moved across to the hanging mirror in which I studied myself, and more particularly my eyes, for several minutes. Now, the mirror reflected my face clearly without blurring, and it showed that the eyes were perfectly steady and the pupils neither unduly dilated nor contracted. Next, I picked up a newspaper and methodically read a paragraph of small type while holding it at arm's length. Satisfied with the result of these tests, I recrossed to the window, where I must have remained staring upwards for at least 10 minutes, at the end of which I again seated myself, picked up my glass, and settled down to face the great problem of my life. And it was a problem indeed, because whilst after my strange optical illusion, all other objects within the room and outside had resumed their usual aspect, The Tower of Moab had not. It remained, as in that revealing moment it had grown, a colossal, fantastic thing, rising infinitely high into the blue upper air from its foundations among the commonplace brick buildings and roofs of slate. Past it, to and fro along the drab pavements, went the inevitable crowd of shoppers and idlers, seeing nothing new, and to and fro likewise went trams, buses, taxis, and private cars, their occupants intent upon their immediate purposes, moving as ever importantly about their business, unaware of this great unearthly column that now towered above them like the finger of God, uplifted in warning. Now, I forget whether it was that evening or in the small hours of Sunday morning that I reached my decision to stay on and learn more of this awful and stupendous thing of which I had been granted a vision. Certainly, it was on the Sunday afternoon that I took pen and paper and wrote to my employers, furnishing an account of my calls for the week and pointing out that I had realised my incompetence for the task which they'd set me and was therewith tendering my resignation in fairness to themselves. As a sop to my conscience, I enclosed a cheque to the value of 2 weeks' wages with an apology for leaving them without due notice. And if at this they returned in that spirit of pique, which is even more peculiar to the dignity of a limited liability company than to that of an individual. To my landlord, I explained that my departure would be indefinitely postponed owing to the praiseworthy privacy of his rooms, which permitted me to concentrate on my literary work better than I'd been able to elsewhere. And he seemed flattered. And in any case, he was not likely to want me to go, since I paid a week in advance, and I was at pains to see that no disturbance took place, even when at intervals alcohol did get the better of me, as it was bound to do under such conditions of mental strain. As day succeeded day, I became more adapted to the extraordinary but publicly unknown fact of the tower's existence as a finished work. In the first week, I secured various textbooks published by the Theosophical Society and kindred bodies, and I refreshed my memory upon a fund of subjects once half studied in the wayward fashion of youthful curiosity. And one paragraph in particular I unearthed from a tome entitled Nature, Spirits and Thought Forms, and I underlined it because it went as follows. It must never be forgotten, it said, that the most transitory, trivial thought born of a human mind is as real and lasting a thing as a house built of stones and mortar. It is not just an impalpable vision, illuminated for so long as the mind retains it, but a positive creation that lives on after the creator has consciously forgotten it for a period proportionate to its own strength. Hence, it has been asserted by numerous clairvoyants that the perpetual concerted faith of devotees in the idolatrous gods of ancient Egypt actually created such beings and endowed them with minds far outreaching those of their creators and a vital force enabling them to exist through the centuries, even down to the present day. Now, applying that principle, which strikes me as a perfectly plausible one, I concluded that for some reason I had been suddenly invested with clairvoyant perception, and I had become aware of the Tower of Moab as conceived in the minds of its founders and completed on the astral plane after its physical growth had stopped. During the second week, I purchased a pair of field glasses, and I spent hours at the sitting room window scrutinizing the higher faces of the tower and the fresh mural panels that gradually unfolded above me. I mean, I realized, of course, the futility of taking anyone else into my confidence. And in order to carry out my design without attracting unwelcome attention from passers-by, I used to lower the Venetian blind during the sunny hours on the pretext of keeping out the heat, and I would conduct my investigations between the slats. But at night, after the household was in bed, I'd come back down to my back room and I'd sit with the blind up, gazing at the vast bulk of the tower, which then stood black and menacing like some great chimney, its top lost in the stars. And it was in the third week of my voluntary imprisonment in that house, because by then I rarely left it for exercise or any other purposes. It was in the third week that I began to see, dimly at first, but with growing clarity, a host of astral organisms that haunted the tower. They seemed to emanate from it, as though its presence gave them link or contact with the world of matter. I mean, they took form identical with that of the cherubim and seraphim, of the familiar old prince, and soon I could discern them by day as well as night, filmy but distinct, circling about the tower, writhing tenuously in the air currents. Sometimes they descended into the busy streets and mingled with the workaday crowds, potent and vital, but all unseen as they moved in weird coexistence with the grosser clay. By daylight, I was aware of distant, effulgent beings borne on bright pinions at an immense height near the crest of the tower. You see, in the hours of darkness, these disappeared. And then out of the earth, where its base now formed a dense pit or pool of shadow, came horrible, reptilian things of gargantuan proportions, which crawled sluggishly about the highways and leered with hydra heads into the windows of drinking places and upon groups of degenerates lounging enviously outside. But mostly, I was absorbed in watching the throng of evilly alluring entities in the likeness of men and women that seemed most closely connected with those humans within my range of vision. I mean, unaware though he or she might be of their proximity, each person who entered the strange pageant was shadowed by two or three of these beings, always fighting among themselves for possession of the body that they pursued, and succeeding in proportion to the victim's natural inclination towards the debaucheries they sought, as by proxy to enjoy. You know, for my part, I'd recline at my window, drinking whiskey with an immunity at which I myself marveled, and speculating cynically on the moral lessons that I was witnessing. You see, my cynicism was short-lived, and swiftly on its heels came the birth of that fundamental horror which could never leave me again, the final unfoldment of my new gift. So I was crouching one vivid afternoon at my usual spot, watching through the chink of the blind a veritable flock of ghoulish wraiths whirling about a young girl who stood on the curb, wearing on her face a look of desperation that spoke of some private tragedy. And all the bitterness of some shocking disillusionment was in that face. And I noticed several people staring at her as they passed. She seemed torn between two impulses, and she would first take a step forward as if to go on her way, and then she would halt in indecision. And all the while, the spirit creatures whirled faster and faster about her, beckoning. I was callously wondering what they wanted of her. When the end came, she uttered a ghastly, sobbing scream and hurled herself with a kind of boneless wriggle under the wheels of a lorry. I swung round, startled at a chorus of low-pitched but intensely dreadful laughter from behind me. It was strange, wasn't it? While unconcernedly watching the hounding of my fellows by these dreadful things, it had never occurred to me that I was other than a spectator. Now, however, my eyes were fully opened, and I knew that I was the destined plaything of a tribe of unthinkable horrors that confronted me. And now, too, the understanding of my sensation of panic on first visiting the tower became clear. Foreordained! For what forgotten guilt, I know not. But this dreadful fate had always been waiting for me. My whole previous life had been nothing more than a cruel prelude to this ultimate moment. To know myself, in common with the greater portion of condemned humanity, inevitably given over to the punishment for original sin. To be the sport of devils forever and ever. I grasped a new bottle of whiskey from the table and I drank myself into a state of insensibility. They took me away at last, after many weeks, to the place where I am now kept. They thought, because I did not argue or seek to explain, that my mind had gone, as though any explanation could be made to ordinary folk without actually strengthening that belief. They supposed that I could not understand because I paid no attention when they spoke in my hearing of a legacy, which was to be handled by trustees to provide for me until I regained my sanity, and of an asylum for dipsomaniacs to which I must go. I didn't realize that I heard and understood every word, because I did not even bother to ask the source or the size of my legacy. I mean, what do I care for this belated affluence when my mind was tortured by the new and appalling burden of knowledge thrust upon it? I made no resistance. When they took my few belongings and escorted me down to a waiting car, on the roof of which crouched an undraped huddle of gesticulating devils, and the headlights of which a 20-foot coil of sluggish reptile was undulating. I was glad to go when I heard that our destination was many miles away on the other coast, because I hoped that when I could no longer see the tower, I might find forgetfulness. It was the vainest wish I could have held. I was drugged that night, and I knew nothing of my journey to the west until I awoke at high noon in the room allotted to me at the asylum. It was an east-facing room, and they'd wheeled my bed into a great bay window where I could benefit by the sunshine and the healthy moorland winds. I turned my head with lethargy and looked out over the heather-clad expanse. The sky was cloudless, a vast vault of blue, divided in two parts by a thin yellow ray, stretching vertically from horizon to zenith. There came a movement somewhere behind me, and a woman's voice suddenly asked, "How do you feel?" I would have replied, because I still retain the instinct of politeness despite my absorption in matters that dwarf conversation. But it was at that very moment that I realized the meaning of the yellow ray. It was the tower. It was the Tower of Moab, so tall that no horizon can hide it. The fearful link forged in man's defiance of God's ordaining that has not only made contact with higher realms, but has given leash to the beasts of the pit. For the first time in my adult life, I opened my lips and screamed.